recent survey performed by the Australian Taxation Office showed that one area self-managed super fund trustees are still having trouble with is the in-house asset rule. With me today in the studio, I have Grant Abbott from SMSF Strategies to discuss some of the issues surrounding this rule. Welcome, Grant.
Thank you very much, Darren. It's great to be here.
What is the in-house asset rule?
In-house assets have actually come a long way, probably been around for about 20 or 30 years. Essentially if you look down and try to put it in a nutshell, it's basically not being able to utilise the assets of the fund for a member. A typical example would be there's nothing wrong with a trustee of a self-managed super fund investing in artwork. However, if that artwork resides inside the fund and then is put inside the person's or one of the members' place of residence, quite often they're obviously utilising those assets. Now, there has been in the past you'd be able to utilise those. As long as you paid an appropriate market value rent, there'd be no breach of what we call the sole purpose test. But the government moved a bit further than that and said, well, hold on, if you're using these assets yourself, even though you're paying rent, you're actually getting a benefit prior to your retirement, and that's where the in-house assets tests come in. If you've got an asset which is such as that, an in-house asset, an asset that you're being used from your fund by yourself or a related party, then effectively it's counted as part of the test, and if you exceed 5%, then it's an extreme no-no inside that fund.
And where do most people come unstuck with it?
It's pretty easy, and I think this is really incumbent upon where the government's coming across. And from a lot of the statistical information and certainly a lot of surveys they've done of trustees, is essentially that most people aren't aware of the in-house assets test. So trustees of the fund, that's primarily the first place they come unstuck, is they're not aware of it. Secondly, where they do come unstuck is they're probably not aware that this valuation exercise is an ongoing process. As I said, with artwork it sounds great. For example, artwork can be a very appropriate investment inside a self-managed super fund. Again, I'm not harping on artwork, I'm just simply saying that this is something that certainly people who collect art might want to consider. But if I bought a Brett Whiteley way back in 1983 for about $3,500, would have been a great investment, put it inside my fund, maybe had it on my wall. The problem about those sort of investments is they continue to grow. That Brett Whiteley painting that I bought for $3,500 is probably worth about $1.5 million now. So as it's gone up, the 5% rule by its very nature is easy to exceed. So it means that each year I have to monitor that process compared to the rest of my assets. For example, if the share market goes down and my whole underlying assets go down, but this underlying in-house asset being, for example, artwork, or it could be even a property, a residential property that I own, which I'm letting my children live in for market value rent. If that starts to decrease or goes above the 5% rule, then obviously I'm in pretty serious trouble.
If trustees are in breach of this rule, what sort of consequences can it have?
Well, there's actually two streams of the rule. The first one is that if you already have in-house assets, you cannot acquire an asset, and if it takes you immediately over 5%, then you breach the rule. Consequences of that is a potential $220,000 fine. If it's a willful breach, there's potential jail sentence, and also there's quite hefty tax penalties. Virtually 50% of the fund could be wasted in a very quick, short period of time. The alternative is you may already have assets and then inadvertently, because of the rise or the fall in other assets or the rise in your in-house asset value, you have inadvertently breached it at year end by just simply the fluctuation of assets. What that requires is then you need to go down the track of putting in place a plan to the trustee of the fund has to divest themselves of an equivalent amount of the excess of those assets in the following income year. And if it divests itself, then there's basically no problem there. So one is you take yourself up and over and above by acquisition of asset, that's a problem. The other one is if it's a creeping acquisition, then you have to put in place a plan, and if you don't dispose of those assets, then effectively what you've got is a serious problem.
The in-house asset rule was expanded in 1999 with some transitional provisions in place. What were some of these?
I suppose the key measure of any test, both in income tax and also the SIS Act, which we're dealing with, is that there's always exceptions to the rule. For example, I could have business real property sitting inside my fund, my office, my farm, my factory, and that could then be leased back to me as my company or family trust or me directly. Now that's a good tax play actually, because what's happening there is I get a deduction for maybe contributions or paying rent into that superannuation fund. They're not classified as contributions. Importantly from that perspective is that would seem to be an in-house asset, but it's exempt because there's a specific exemption around in-house asset rules where I lease it, that business real property, directly from a related party. Now, they changed the rules in 1999 to bring in place leases, certain investments in what we call related trusts or very closely held unit trusts that were sitting outside the in-house assets test at that time. Now, those specific exceptions that they brought in, effectively in 1998, in the budget of 1998, Castillo came out and said from this day onwards, that's it, all those closely related unit trusts are gone. But what he did is he gave some exceptions, and one of them is any underlying asset that was held prior to 1999, which is August 1999, such as a unit in a unit trust, even though it's a related trust after that point in time, those existing units in that unit trust were exempt from the in-house assets, as were a couple of other distributions that were made from those unit trusts up to 30 June 2009, which is just around the corner.
And in relation to these distributions, what are some of the things people have to look out for?
It's a really good question, Darren. 30 June's coming up. There was a couple of specific exemptions to the rule. First one is that, and people quite often really get mixed up with this, is that a self-managed super fund can continue to put contributions into this related trust. There's two opposing rules. The first one is it can put in capital up to whatever the underlying borrowings were in that trust as at August 1999. The problem about that is that in order to do so, that's what we call the geared unit trust election. That had to be made in 2000. If that hadn't been made, then effectively the other exemption applies. That other exemption relates to the distribution or distributions made from that unit trust down to the self-managed super fund at any time up to 30 June 2009. The quantum or the amount of those distributions can then be recapitalised back into that superannuation fund, allowing the superannuation fund to really keep on putting investments inside that unit trust before it's classified as an in-house asset after 30 June 2009. I think it's really important, and there'll be another talk in this series about SMSF borrowings, but the ability to keep and create a unit trust, if you've got one prior to 30 June 1999, is like gold. You really must see an advisor before 30 June 2009 to see what sort of capital can be put back up into that trust without breaching the in-house asset rules.
Thanks for your time today, Grant.
My pleasure, Darren.